I used to believe life was just life, a simple, predictable path from birth to oblivion. But then, one bitter cold afternoon, clinging to a broken sled, hurtling towards a brick wall, my entire world shattered. In that split second, facing what I was sure was my end, something impossible happened. My whole life flashed before my eyes, not as a blur, but with startling clarity, every memory vivid and profound. It defied everything I thought I knew about reality, and it changed me forever. I was convinced that if anything truly astonishing ever happened to me, only then would I consider that miracles were possible. But nothing ever did. Just the mundane, everyday existence of a plain, unremarkable kid. Before that day, my life was, by all accounts, quite ordinary. I grew up in the East End of Toronto in the 1950s and 60s, a typical suburban childhood filled with the usual routines and simple pleasures. I was a quiet, observant kid, often lost in my own thoughts, with a vivid imagination that frequently conjured up fantastical scenarios. My days were a predictable cycle of school, playing with friends, and the comforting rhythms of family life. We went to Sunday school at the United Church, more out of tradition than deep conviction, which suited me just fine, because even then, a seed of skepticism had taken root. From a very young age, I'd adopted a rather firm stance on reality. If I couldn't see it, touch it, or logically explain it, it probably didn't exist. The magic of childhood, the tooth fairy, the Easter bunny, Santa Claus, had all been debunked by the time I was old enough to put two and two together. This led to a rather logical, if somewhat cynical, conclusion. If those figures were fabricated, then perhaps the idea of a bearded old man in the sky orchestrating everything was equally so. I became, for all intents and purposes, an atheist. I remember distinctly a sort of internal pact I made with myself. If just one truly amazing thing, one unequivocally inexplicable event ever happened to me, then I'd open my mind to the possibility of the extraordinary. But year after year, nothing. No ghostly encounters, no whispers from the beyond, no telekinetic powers that would send a pencil flying across the room. I was just a normal, boring kid, and that only solidified my conviction. My emotional landscape was generally even-keeled. I wasn't particularly ecstatic or profoundly sad. There was a sort of quiet contentment in the everyday, and the warmth of my home and the familiar faces of my family. Yet underneath that placid surface, there was a subtle yearning, an unarticulated search for something more. I wasn't consciously looking for meaning or purpose beyond what was presented to me, but there was a quiet undercurrent of curiosity about the unseen, even if my rational mind vehemently denied its existence. My routine was simple. Mornings spent at school, afternoons filled with outdoor play, though winter often meant being bundled up so heavily I could barely move. I was a creature of habit, finding comfort in the predictable rhythm of my days. My disposition was generally calm, though my imagination could sometimes run wild, conjuring vivid anxieties like the fear of my fingers getting frostbite and snapping off during a long winter day. These small, fleeting worries were usually overshadowed by the simple joys of childhood, like the thrill of a fast sled ride. I had no real thoughts about death beyond the abstract. It was a distant, theoretical concept, something that happened to other people much later in life. It certainly wasn't something I dwelled on. My focus was on the here and now, on the tangible world around me. My beliefs were firmly rooted in the physical, the observable, and that unwavering skepticism, that steadfast refusal to entertain anything beyond the material, would make the experience that followed all the more bewildering. It was a foundation of disbelief, set to be irrevocably shaken. The sled's trajectory would bring me dangerously close to that solid brick building. I assured my father I could steer clear, never imagining how quickly control could vanish,
leaving me hurtling towards a horrifying end. The day started like many other Saturdays during those seemingly endless Toronto winters of the 1960s. The air outside was so sharp, it felt like it could shatter. But the sun was out, a brilliant, almost blinding white against the endless expanse of blue sky. This was a rare, coveted combination. Bitter cold, yes, but glorious sunshine, promising perfect sledding conditions. For weeks, I've been pestering my dad to take me and my little sister to the park, and finally, he caved. Getting ready for winter play was an ordeal in itself. My mom would bundle my sister into so many layers that she resembled a Michelin man, utterly incapable of walking under her own power. Dad would have to drag her on the sled, a comical sight. I was older, maybe 7 or 8, and could dress myself, but the layers were still formidable. First, 2 pairs of my dad's thickest wool socks over my shoes. Then those enormous, clunky brown plastic snow boots that went up to mid-calf. They had this buckle and strap arrangement meant to keep snow out, which, of course, never worked. Snow always found its way in, chilling my ankles. Over that, a padded nylon snowsuit, so bulky it restricted my movements, but offered essential warmth. My hands were encased in thick wool gloves, then covered by even heavier leather mittens. I was terrified of frostbite, convinced my fingers would snap off like icicles. My neck was practically mummified in an impossibly long knitted scarf, wrapped multiple times to prevent my breath from freezing before it even reached my lungs. And another shorter scarf was tied around my forehead. My imaginative young mind was quite concerned about my brain freezing. We finally arrived at the park on the Danforth near Woodbine. It was, as expected, a chaotic wonderland. Hundreds of kids and teenagers, a cacophony of shrieks and laughter, were a blur of motion, racing down the steep hill on anything that could slide, sleds, toboggans, even garbage can lids. The sight of it made my dad grimace, clearly contemplating turning us right around. But I pointed out a less crowded spot at the far end of the hill, a little oasis of untouched snow. Reluctantly, he agreed. As we trudged through the snow to our chosen takeoff point, the cold gradually receded, replaced by a growing warmth from the exertion. The only part of me that still felt the bite of the wind was my exposed eyes, which began to tear up from the sheer speed of my accelerating descent. The slope, which to my 8-year-old self felt like my own personal Everest, stretched out before me. The one slight concern was the park maintenance shed at the bottom of the hill. A small, solid brick building, it housed equipment on one side and public washrooms on the other. It loomed directly in the path of anyone daring enough to aim for the steepest part of the slope. I wasn't worried, though. Our sled had this fantastic wooden bar across the front, a clever steering mechanism with ropes attached to each side. I could easily steer away from the shed, I assured my dad, who seemed less convinced. He held the sled steady as I settled myself, sitting upright, legs stretched out, a steering rope clutched in each mittened hand. The cold was a distant memory now, replaced by the thrilling anticipation. There were no premonitions, no subtle shivers of foreboding, just pure, unadulterated excitement. With a solid push from my dad's hands on my back, I was off. The wind screamed past my ears, the snow-covered world blurring into a white streak. I was flying, utterly alive, hurtling down the hill, unaware that in mere seconds, this exhilarating ride would transform into something utterly terrifying. The tension wasn't a slow build, it was an invisible thread, about to snap with catastrophic suddenness. In that terrifying instant, as the brick wall loomed closer and the certainty of impact consumed me, my entire existence unfurled before my eyes. Every single moment, every thought, every interaction, a panoramic, instantaneous revelation that defied all logic and time. The wind, which moments before had been a joyous companion, a thrilling rush against my face, now morphed into a piercing, high-pitched shriek. It was no longer the sound of exhilaration, but a harbinger of imminent disaster. I was at the absolute zenith of my wild ride, flying down the hill with what felt like impossible speed, when it happened. The right steering rope, my control, my very lifeline, snapped with a sudden, sickening jolt. I felt it tear free from the heavy leather of my mittened hand, a sensation both sharp and utterly disbelieving. In a flash, the sled, now a rogue, uncontrollable beast, veered violently to the left, directly, irrevocably, towards that solid, unyielding brick maintenance shed. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. It wasn't just a thought. It was a visceral, all-consuming wave that washed over my 7-year-old self. My child's mind screamed, not in a voice I could hear, but in a raw, instinctual certainty. No way could I risk running into that shed. I would surely be killed. The image, vivid and terrifying, solidified in my mind's eye. My small body, crushed, broken, my brains smeared red and gray across the pristine white of the snow. I had to save myself. There was only one thought, one desperate primal impulse: bail. I instinctively rolled to my left, tumbling off the sled and into the snow, believing for a split second, a fleeting moment of relief, that I was safe. But the nightmare wasn't over. As I struggled, disoriented, to clear the wet, cold snow from my eyes, a new horror dawned, even more chilling than the last. The rope, that same broken rope, still stubbornly attached to the now runaway sled, had somehow, impossibly, snagged itself around the heavy buckle of my enormous, clumsy brown snow boot. The weight of the sled, gathering frightening momentum as it continued its downhill trajectory, was dragging me. It was pulling me, inch by horrifying inch, then foot by terrifying foot, inexorably closer to that unyielding brick wall. The vision of my demise, graphic and absolute, solidified once more. No longer a possibility, but a certain, imminent reality. My eyes squeezed shut, a futile attempt to block out the inevitable. I opened my mouth to scream, a primal, desperate sound forming deep within my chest, a final, despairing cry that never actually escaped my lips. And in that very instant, just as the scream was forming, just as my small body braced for the impact that I was absolutely certain would be my end, something utterly impossible, something beyond comprehension occurred. It wasn't a sound or a flash of light or a feeling of being pulled from my body in the dramatic way some describe, no floating above. Instead, the physical world, the biting cold, the screaming wind, the terrifying sensation of being dragged, the looming shed, they all simply vanished. My awareness of my physical body, the terror, the cold, the clumsy bulk of my snowsuit, it all ceased. It was as if a switch had been flipped, but not off. Instead, it was flipped on to a state of being profoundly, incredibly more aware than I had ever been in my life.
I was enveloped in an experience of heightened consciousness, a state of absolute, undeniable clarity. Everything was not just clear, it was hyper-real, making perfect, undeniable sense in a way that my earthly 8-year-old mind could never have conceived. My thoughts, usually a jumble of childish concerns and fleeting impressions, were now incredibly fast, yet perfectly coherent, interconnected, and profound. Time, as I knew it, seemed to dissolve. It didn't speed up or slow down. It simply ceased to exist. Everything happened at once, yet each detail, each nuance, each fleeting moment of my past was distinct, perfectly rendered, and fully comprehensible. What unfolded before me was a panoramic, all-encompassing review of my entire life, from my earliest, hazy memories right up to that very second of perceived death. It wasn't a series of disjointed images flickering past like old photographs.
It was a continuous, flowing tapestry of existence, intricately woven, each thread connected to the next. Every single thing I had ever done, every word I had ever spoken, every sight I had ever witnessed, every thought that had ever crossed my mind, it was all there, laid bare. I saw every piece of clothing I had ever worn, felt the texture of the fabric, smelled the detergent. I tasted every meal I had ever eaten, from bland everyday dinners to special occasion treats, reliving the sensations on my tongue. Every person I had ever known, my parents, my sister, my grandparents, my teachers, every kid I had ever played with, even the fleeting faces of strangers, they were all present. Every book I had ever read, its pages turning instantaneously in my mind. Every TV show I had ever watched, the scenes playing out with perfect detail. And yes, every puppy, kitten, and hamster I had ever petted and cuddled, their soft fur under my small fingers, their gentle purrs and playful antics were re-experienced with profound emotional resonance, as if I were there with them again in that very moment. But it wasn't just a passive viewing, a cosmic film strip. The most profound and utterly transformative aspect of this full life review was the understanding that accompanied it. In that instant, I didn't just see my life, I understood everything about it. I grasped my own motivations behind every single action, every word, every decision I had ever made, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. Why I'd taken that extra cookie, why I said something mean to my sister, why I chose one toy over another, it all became transparent, laid bare with absolute clarity. More astonishingly, I understood the motivations of everyone I had ever interacted with. It was as if I was seeing the intricate, invisible web of cause and effect, the hidden currents beneath every exchange, every glance, every conversation. Why a friend had reacted a certain way to my words, why a teacher had disciplined me, why my parents had made certain choices that I confused, it all became undeniably clear. There was no judgment, no accusation, no condemnation, just pure, unadulterated understanding, a profound empathy that transcended my young age. The emotions I felt during this experience were a complex yet harmonious tapestry. There was immense amazement, a profound sense of awe at the sheer scope and detail of what I was witnessing, at the effortless way such an immense amount of information could be processed in an instant. There was a deep sense of confusion, too, because it utterly defied every logical framework, every scientific principle I'd been taught or observed in my short life. This could not be happening, yet it was. But overriding these more disorienting feelings was a deep sense of relief and calmness. The visceral terror of the impending impact, the certainty of my violent death, it had utterly vanished, replaced by an inexplicable tranquility, a quiet, profound peace that settled deep within me. There was no bursting joy in the traditional sense, no giddy euphoria, but a quiet, profound sense of acceptance and peace that transcended any earthly feeling. I was also filled with an immense gratitude, not towards any specific entity, but a general, overwhelming appreciation for the richness and complexity of existence itself, even my own brief one. And then there was the profound sensation of unity, not with a specific being or a brilliant light or a welcoming presence. My experience was devoid of those common NDE elements. Instead, it was a profound, undeniable sense of being united with the world, with everything. It was a feeling of interconnectedness, of being part of a larger, harmonious whole. Though I was far too young to articulate it in grand philosophical terms like universal consciousness or the oneness of all things, the sensation was unmistakable. It was a deep, inherent belonging, a fundamental, undeniable truth that permeated my entire being. It was as if the individual boundaries of me blurred, and I became inextricably linked to the fabric of existence, understanding its underlying harmony. This understanding, this feeling of unity, was not something I was told or shown through visions. It was simply known. It was an inherent truth that permeated every fiber of my being, a Gnostic revelation. This profound experience was singularly focused on the internal, on the instantaneous, all-encompassing review of my own existence and the deep understanding that came with it. There was no tunnel to pass through, no brilliant, unearthly light, no distinct voices, no sounds beyond the white noise of pure awareness. I didn't see any deceased relatives or friends, nor any mystical beings, mentors, or religious figures. There were no visions of the future or the past that weren't directly linked to my own life. I did not enter some other unearthly world, at least not in any visual or tangible sense. My journey was entirely within the boundless expanse of my own conscious memory and understanding. This was not a dream, not a fleeting hallucination, not a cliché I'd read in a book or heard on TV. It was an impossible event, happening within the confines of my own consciousness, triggered by the absolute, unwavering certainty of my imminent death. And the knowledge it imparted, the profound understanding of motivations, the undeniable feeling of unity with everything, was not just intellectual. It was a deep, spiritual knowing, a Gnostic revelation. I was suspended in this hyper-aware state, absorbing truths about myself and the world, truths that would lay dormant for years, only to resurface later with world-shattering implications. In that moment, I was simply being, absorbing, understanding, completely unaware of what would happen next, or if there even would be a next.
One moment, I was suspended in a realm of pure understanding, every secret of my life laid bare. The next, a jarring thump, and the stark reality of cold snow and coarse rope yanked me back, a bewildering, uncomfortable return to a world that felt suddenly alien. The transition was as abrupt and disorienting as a punch to the gut. 1 nanosecond, I was existing in a state of absolute clarity, timeless understanding, immersed in the panoramic tapestry of my entire life, comprehending motivations and feeling an undeniable unity with everything. The next, with an unpleasant jolt, I was back. The cold, harsh reality of the snow against my cheek slammed into me, followed by the rough, insistent pull of the sled rope still tangled around my boot. It was a jarring, almost violent re-entry into the physical. There was no gradual fading from that heightened state, no gentle descent. It was instantaneous, a sudden, brutal re-establishment of physical sensation. The lightness, the clarity, the profound understanding, all compressed and then, in an instant, replaced by the mundane discomfort of my heavily bundled body. I felt the pressure of the snowsuit, the clumsy weight of my boots, the familiar ache of cold seeping into my extremities. There was no intense pain from the impact I had anticipated, but a dull, generalized soreness, a peculiar heaviness that felt utterly alien after the boundlessness of the moment before. It was a profound shock, a sense of reanimation that was deeply unsettling. My eyes popped open suddenly, as if waking from a deep, profound sleep. Disorientation was my first sensation, not just of space, but of existence itself. Where am I? What just happened? The vibrant, all-knowing experience was still echoing in the recesses of my mind, a fresh memory, yet the immediate surroundings were the familiar, mundane park. My gaze fell upon the brick shed, now surprisingly distant, a dozen meters away. The horror I had felt moments before, the certainty of my brain smeared on the snow, now seemed absurd, yet the memory of it was still sharp, tinged with disbelief. My first coherent thought,
Perhaps even before fully processing my physical presence was an overwhelming sense of bewilderment. Why was I back? There was a fleeting, almost melancholic disappointment. I hadn't wanted to return. That other place, that state of knowing, had been so real, so infinitely more meaningful than this clumsy, cold, limited existence. It was like being pulled from a dazzling, vivid dream into a dull, gray morning. But the dream felt truer. I struggled to reconcile the infinite complexity of what I had just experienced with the simple, snowy hill around me. Then a familiar sound cut through the lingering haze of the impossible. My dad's voice. "Are you okay?" he gasped, collapsing beside me in the snow. He was a disheveled mess, having slid and scrambled down the hill on one foot and one hand, clearly terrified. For those of you wondering about my little sister left alone at the top of the hill, this was Toronto in the 1950s. Broad daylight, public park. She was perfectly safe, thankfully. My immediate reaction was to blurt out the most impactful thing I could remember, something so monumental that it had to be understood. "Dad, my whole life just flashed in front of my eyes." He looked at me, perplexed, struggling to catch his breath. "What?" "I just saw everything in my life, all at once. Every single thing." My voice was urgent, filled with the raw shock of the experience, pleading for him to understand. His response, though, was swift and dismissive, laced with a paternal desire to calm and rationalize. "Don't be silly." He reached out to help me up. I tried again, desperate for validation. "Yeah, but remember when Butch Castle said I stole that dime and—" He cut me off. "Come on, get up. You're going to catch cold and your mother will kill me. We have to get back home, and now that the sled is broken, I don't know how—" His voice trailed off as he stomped back up the hill, dragging the useless, splintered sled behind him. His focus was entirely on the practicalities, the immediate problem, the fear of my mother's wrath. Later that day, back in the warmth of our house, still reeling from the inner earthquake I'd just experienced, I tried to tell my mother. Her reaction was basically the same, a gentle but firm, "Don't be silly." I think now, with the wisdom of decades, that they probably believed I was simply parroting some cliché I'd read in a comic book or heard on TV. Someone said their whole life flashed before their eyes, they must have thought, and she thought it sounded mysterious and cool. They were kind, concerned, but utterly incapable of comprehending the magnitude of what I was trying to convey. It was just a child's fanciful tale, easily dismissed. My physical body, once the immediate danger was gone, felt heavy and sluggish. A profound weakness settled over me, as if every ounce of energy had been drained, replaced by a lingering disassociation. The vibrant, clear vision I'd had during the review was gone, replaced by my usual short-sightedness. My limbs felt leaden, my movements clumsy. The contrast was stark, from boundless clarity to earthly limitations, from effortless understanding to mundane confusion. I didn't share it with anyone else for a very long time. The dismissive reactions of my parents, whom I trusted implicitly, taught me a silent lesson. This was something too strange, too unbelievable to speak of. It was my secret, a profound truth, locked away in my memory, waiting for a time when I might finally be able to make sense of it or find someone who could. The world outside, represented by my well-meaning but uncomprehending parents, wasn't ready for what I had seen. And neither was I, perhaps. Not yet. My perspective on reality shifted completely. I used to think there were only two kinds of people, those who believed in something more and those who absolutely knew there wasn't. Now I understand there are profound truths revealed not just by science, but by direct spiritual knowing. For many years after that astonishing afternoon, the experience lay dormant within me, a deeply buried secret. My parents' dismissive reactions, though well-intentioned, effectively taught me that this was something too outlandish, too unbelievable to share. I internalized it, carrying it like a peculiar, heavy stone in the quiet corners of my mind. It would surface occasionally, a vivid, fragmented echo, but without context or validation, it remained an isolated, personal oddity. I continued through my childhood and adolescence outwardly unchanged, still the same skeptical kid, navigating the world with a rational, materialist lens. The initial bewilderment faded into the background, replaced by the pressing concerns of growing up. Then, as I approached my 20th birthday, something shifted. The memory of that day on the sled resurfaced with renewed intensity, no longer a vague echo, but a sharp, clear recollection, every detail as crisp as if it had just happened. But this time, I wasn't merely remembering, I was reevaluating. My mind, now more mature, began to grapple with the sheer impossibility of what I had experienced. A full, instantaneous review of my entire life at 7 years old. And critically, when my brain was in no danger of shutting down, as some scientific explanations for NDEs suggest, this time I had access to a wider world of information. I began to seek answers. That's when I stumbled upon the concept of the near-death experience, or NDE. Reading accounts, I was struck with the uncanny familiarity of certain elements, particularly the full life review. It was like finding a map to a place I'd only vaguely remembered, a language for a phenomenon I thought was uniquely my own. The realization was profound, shattering my entrenched skepticism not with dogma, but with direct, undeniable personal truth. The first, most immediate, and perhaps most liberating change was the complete loss of my fear of death. Before, death was an unknown void, an end to everything. After my realization, it transformed into something less terrifying, a transition rather than an annihilation. It wasn't that I suddenly embraced a traditional religious afterlife. Rather, I understood that consciousness, or at least some form of profound awareness, can exist and even expand beyond the physical body, beyond what we perceive as life. This didn't make me reckless, but it imbued me with a deep, quiet sense of peace about the inevitable. My worldview underwent a complete overhaul. I was an atheist before, firmly rooted in scientific materialism. That rigid certainty was replaced not by blind faith, but by a nuanced understanding that reality is far more expansive and complex than material science alone can explain. I still didn't believe in the Abrahamic God. No bearded man on a cloud appeared to me, but I gained an undeniable conviction in a universal consciousness, an underlying fabric of reality of which we are all a part. My sense of unity during the NDE wasn't just a fleeting feeling, it became a foundational truth. I now perceive that there is something profound, interconnected, and eternally existing, and that my individual consciousness, though distinct, is inextricably linked to this greater whole. This shift wasn't always easy. I suppose I developed less tolerance for fundamentalist viewpoints, whether religious or purely scientific materialist. Those who insisted that reality was only what they could measure or only what their specific doctrine declared felt, to me, to be missing a crucial dimension. Integrating this Gnostic experience into everyday life, especially in a world that largely dismisses such phenomena, presented its own challenges. It's hard to articulate something so deeply personal and transformative to those who haven't experienced it themselves, leading to a sense of isolation at times. I learned to choose carefully with whom I shared my story, knowing that understanding was rare. My priorities in life shifted dramatically. The mundane concerns that once occupied my thoughts seemed less significant. Material possessions, societal status, fleeting pleasures, while not entirely dismissed, they no longer held the same power over me. What truly mattered were connections, understanding, and the pursuit of knowledge. Not just scientific, but spiritual. My interests gravitated towards the philosophy of consciousness, exploring different spiritual traditions. I even embraced Wicca for a time, drawn to its reverence for nature and interconnectedness, before settling into a more spiritual but not religious stance. The pursuit of truth became less about proving or disproving and more about integrating different ways of knowing. I didn't develop a new mission in the traditional sense, like becoming a preacher or a full-time NDE researcher, but there was an undeniable impulse to share what I had learned, to bear witness to the reality of these experiences. It became important to me to affirm that there are other ways to discover truth beyond just the scientific method and empiricism. Some truths, I realized, aren't scientific. They are spiritual. When someone undergoes an experience that reveals such a spiritual truth, they achieve what I call gnosis, a direct, knowing understanding. This gnosis, I firmly believe, is every bit as valid as scientific knowledge, and perhaps even more necessary for the collective survival and evolution of humanity. We must stop ignoring it, or worse, mocking it. Both types of knowledge, the scientific and the spiritual, must be combined, respected, and allowed to work together if we are truly to understand our universe and ourselves.
In closing, what I experienced on that cold winter day was not a dream, not a delusion, but a profound, undeniable glimpse behind the veil of ordinary reality. It wasn't about tunnels or lights or meeting beings, but about an absolute, instant comprehension of my own being and its connection to everything else. It taught me that there's a vast, intricate web of existence that we are all a part of, and that understanding our place within it can transform our fears into peace, our doubts into certainty, and our skepticism into wonder. Perhaps, like me, you thought you knew what reality was. Perhaps, like me, you felt there was nothing beyond the tangible. But I hope my story leaves you with a question, an opening. What if there is more? What if the impossible is simply waiting for you to realize it's real? What if the deepest truths are waiting not in books or laboratories, but within the very core of your own consciousness?